Good evening. Welcome to the Oxford Interfaith Forum discussion on pilgrimage and migration. This is a special event that we have today with some remarkable speakers from the US and UK. On behalf of Tiago Mallory and myself, would really like to extend a very warm welcome to you and thanks for making time to join us tonight. We have a star-studded lineup. We've got three speakers. Professor Elizabeth Kish will open with a welcome address, followed by Dr. Eboo Patel from the US and Lord John Alderdice. And thereafter, we will have an opportunity for Q&A and discussions. If you have any questions that come to mind, please feel free to put them on the chat. And during the Q&A, you can put your hand up either physically or using the Zoom icon. If you've got any subsequent thoughts that you'd like to share with us, please do get in touch with us. You all have our email address. And of course, please do visit our website, oxfordinterfaithforum.org. It's a great honor to begin by introducing Professor Kish before taking up the wardenship in 2018 of Rhodes House. And of course, she's a professorial fellow as well. She served for 12 years as president of Agnes Scott College in Georgia. During her tenure, Agnes Scott broke records for enrollment and retention and was named the second most diversified college in America by Time and the country's most successful liberal arts college for graduating low-income students by the US Department of Education. In December 2017, the Chronicle of Higher Education named Elizabeth Kish on its 2017 list of the most influential people in US higher education. From 1997 to 2006, Dr. Kish served as the founding director of Duke University's Keenan Institute for Ethics, building a university-wide interdisciplinary center focused on promoting moral reflection and commitment in personal, professional, organizational, and civic life. Dr. Kish has had a long-standing career in academia. She has taught at the Randolph-Macon College in Virginia, Deep Springs College, California, and at Princeton University for 8 years. Her academic focus has been on moral and political philosophy, and she has published on moral education, human rights, ethnic conflict and nationalism, feminist theory, and transitional justice. Dr. Kish received her BA in philosophy magna cum laude from Davidson College in North Carolina, where she became Davidson's first female Rhodes Scholar, going on to achieve a BPhil at Balliol College, Oxford, and DPhil in philosophy from the University of Oxford. She has held many leadership roles in local and national organizations, including the Climate Leadership Network, the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, and the Women's College Coalition. She has always remained strongly connected with the Rhodes community, having mentored Rhodes applicants for over 25 years and serving for 22 years on the Rhodes selection committees, including 6 years as state secretary in North Carolina. From a personal point of view, one of the most special things from our point of view is that Elizabeth is a friend of the Oxford Interfaith Forum and has so kindly made time to join us this evening. I gladly hand the floor over to you, Elizabeth.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for that extraordinarily generous introduction, and a warm welcome to all of you, and a congratulations to the Oxford Interfaith Forum for this wonderful series of programs that you have launched, and I'm excited. This is my first opportunity to participate in an Interfaith Forum event, but as I've looked at the range of programming that you organize, it is very exciting and timely and important. And you know, as many of you may know, 1871 was the year that the Universities Test Act was passed in the United Kingdom. So it seems this was when the last religious restrictions were dropped in university admissions in the United Kingdom. And so I think it's particularly appropriate, not only because of all the things that are happening in the world where interfaith understanding and interfaith leadership, the ability to lead and engage in an interfaith world and an interfaith community is so important. I also think it's wonderful that that Oxford has such a vibrant interfaith forum as we, mark the centenary of when this university became a more open, we're still on that journey, but a more open university to people from all faiths. Women actually took a little bit longer, and sadly it took the Rhodes Scholarship even longer to admit women. We didn't start having women Rhodes Scholars until the 1970s. So we're all on this journey of becoming more inclusive, but also creating the space and the community and building the capacities in ourselves and in our students and across our institutions for interfaith learning and dialogue. And so I'm really excited to be here with all of you to hear from our distinguished speakers about pilgrimage and migration in interfaith contexts. These are concepts that are so resonant and important across so many religious traditions, pilgrimage and migration. And I suppose they also speak to those of us like Eboo Patel, who I'm about to introduce, and myself, who migrated, you could say made a pilgrimage to Oxford University as Rhodes Scholars to this extraordinary center of learning as Rhodes Scholars, and of course, many other international students over the years and the centuries who have come to Oxford, where we are so proud and delighted to claim Eboo Patel as one of our very distinguished Rhodes Scholar alumni, someone who has been such a creative and innovative leader in interfaith work, not only in higher education, but in the broader public and civic sphere. So let me tell you a little bit about Eboo. He is an Ismaili Muslim American of Gujarati Indian heritage, grew up in Illinois, now lives in Chicago. We are very, very pleased that in 1998, he was selected as a Rhodes Scholar and came to Oxford, was where he earned his DPhil in sociology. And we were just speaking a few minutes earlier that he was very involved in interfaith work in Oxford, and it was a part of his own interfaith journey, which continued in 2002 when he formed an organization he still leads, Interfaith Youth Corps, which has truly become I would say, the national leader in the United States for inspiring and engaging young people to become interfaith leaders. Young people all across the United States, colleges and universities all across the United States have been engaged in that journey of Interfaith Youth Corps, which Eboo formed with a Jewish friend in 2002 with what I suspect was a very, very small budget, and has been able to sustain and build and grow that work. He has also served as a member of President Obama's Advisory Council on Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships, and he's written several really powerful books on interfaith leadership and learning, including Acts of Faith, the story of an American Muslim, the struggle for the soul of a generation, as well as Interfaith Leadership, a primer, Sacred Ground, Pluralism, Prejudice, and the Promise of America, and most recently, Out of Many Faiths, Religious Diversity and the American Promise. So Eboo, we are delighted to have you with us to speak to this group about pilgrimage and migration in interfaith contexts.
Thank you so much, Warden Keese, my friend Elizabeth, I will call you. We have been friends for 20 years, and I'm so proud that you are the warden of Rhodes House and are steering the trust in such positive directions. To the distinguished organizers of the Oxford Interfaith Forum, Tatea and Ghulam Abbas and others, thank you so much for the work you're doing. It really continues in a tradition of Oxford leading interfaith work. When I was a student there in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, I was part of the International Interfaith Center at Oxford. I was part of the United Religions Initiative UK. There's long been leadership in the United Kingdom for interfaith work. The great Marcus Braybrook, John Hick, and others. So I was proud to have been a beneficiary of that leadership when I was in England many years ago, and to carry on in whatever ways I am able to with my colleagues at IFYC in the United States. So I take the topic here quite seriously. I think it's such an interesting and important topic. And I'm going to be a bit cheeky in the way I begin my addressing of this. I'm going to begin with an Englishman who made a pilgrimage, a migration across the Atlantic to what became the United States of America. In the year 1630, a man named John Winthrop leaves England, becomes known as a Puritan, which is to say somebody who seeks to purify the church, the Protestant church, of its Catholic influences. And he comes to Massachusetts Bay. He establishes what he calls a city on a hill in Boston. And along the way on this migration, he gives amongst the most well-known sermons in American history, where he says, we shall be a city on a hill, the eyes of the world upon us. We shall labor together, rejoice together, suffer together. And part of what is striking about the use of city on a hill in that sermon, of course, it's biblical. It gets forgotten for centuries and then resurrected in the mid-20th century by John F. Kennedy. And Kennedy says when he assumes the presidency, today assumes the role of Senator of Massachusetts. Today, the eyes of all people are truly upon us, and our governments in every branch, at every level, national, state, and local, must be as a city upon a hill, constructed, inhabited by men, he says, aware of their great trust and their great responsibilities. We are setting out upon a voyage in 1961, it must have been when he had recently become president, no less hazardous than that undertaken by the Arabella in 1630. So Kennedy brings city on a hill 330 years later back into the national consciousness. Reagan is probably the person who resurrects city on a hill most fulsomely. So Reagan says in his farewell address, I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. In my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks, stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds, living in harmony and peace. A city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. If there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get there. That's how I saw it and see it still. Okay, so this is 1988, Reagan's farewell address. And then there's Obama. Obama uses the city on a hill sermon as well. And he speaks of the city on a hill as a place that the United States should aspire to, where there is no subjugation of women, where there is no racism, on and on, okay? The first Catholic president, okay, the president who kind of resurrects American conservatism in the 1980s, speaks of the city on a hill teeming with diversity, windswept and God-blessed. And then Obama speaks of the city on a hill as a place with no subjugation of women and no racism. So why is this interesting in the context of interfaith migrations? Because John Winthrop's city on a hill was, as he says directly, a bulwark against the papacy, a city that would avoid the designs of Jesuits. Who's the first American president who brings the city on a hill back into American consciousness. It's the first Catholic president. How interesting when a migration made for religious reasons shifts meaning over time. John Winthrop is leaving England because of Catholic influence in the Anglican Church. He is quoting the Bible as he does it. He is saying, actually, on the Arabella, as he is crossing the Atlantic Ocean, we risk a shipwreck if we allow strange gods into our city on a hill. And Reagan, 350 years later, is saying the American city on a hill is a place teeming with diversity. If there have to be walls, let those walls have doors to let anybody whose heart loves freedom into the city. Let's leave aside what Reagan did for a moment and just focus on what he said. Okay. The Kennedy-Reagan city on a hill is a diverse city. The Winthrop city on a hill is a bulwark against the papacy. Peter Mansell, great American historian of religion, says it's a lot closer to Calvin's Geneva than it is to Obama's American promise. Incidentally, speaking of Obama, he invokes the city on a hill as a place where there would be no subjugation of women and no racism. What does Mr. Winthrop do when he arrives in what is to become the United States of America? He banishes Anne Hutchinson for being a female teacher of the gospel. He is not particularly kind to the indigenous people around him. How the language of migration changes over time. Incidentally, I have to say, I think this is an entirely positive thing. I think religions give us remarkably resonant language that ought to change over time. And that language often comes, those lessons often come in the context of migrations. So I want to use a couple of examples from Islam on this and ask the question, what migrations symbolic from our diverse traditions might be offered up to the world for the same resonance and new meanings? And actually, in Islam, within the time of the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings be upon him, there's actually, I think, kind of an Exhibit A example. So the Prophet Muhammad does not invent the Hajj. Islam does not invent the Hajj. There are pilgrimages to Mecca that have been made for generations and generations by the various tribes of the Hijaz, of the Arabian Peninsula. And one of the ways that the tribes located in Mecca, the Quraysh, etc., become prominent is that they protect the tribes who are coming in to circumambulate the Kaaba, and those tribes bring idols of their god. So around the Kaaba, in what Muslims call the Jahiliyyah, the pre-Islamic times, there are all of these idols to various gods around the Kaaba. Of course, for people who know Abrahamic history, this raises a very interesting image, which is the prophet Abraham, may the peace and blessings of God be upon him, crashing the idols in his father's corner store. Abraham builds the Kaaba with both Isaac and Ishmael, both of his sons. Okay, over time, the Kaaba becomes a place where people make pilgrimage, but to a variety of gods. The Prophet Muhammad keeps the idea of the pilgrimage, but he, like Abraham, crashes the idols around the Kaaba and returns it to its original meaning of prayer to one God. What's the point that I'm making? That the power of migration shifts meaning over time. What migrations might we take and give new meaning in our time in ways that do what I think is all important, which is to provide a binding narrative for a diverse democracy? I'm going to say that again. I think amongst the great challenges of our time, how do you provide a binding narrative for a diverse democracy? I want to go back to City on a Hill for a second, right? John Winthrop provides a binding narrative for a homogenous city. City on a Hill is a binding narrative for we are all the same and we are going to exclude difference violently, whether it's Roger Williams or it's Ann Hutchinson or it's the Native Americans here or it's Catholic influence. Kennedy, Reagan, Obama take that same migratory narrative and its chief symbol, City on a Hill, and they use it as a binding narrative for an increasingly diverse society. So here are two migrations in Islam that I think would be particularly useful as binding narratives for diverse societies. One, obviously, is the Hijra of 622, when the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of God be upon him, migrates from the city of Mecca, where he is being harassed and hounded. He migrates to what is known at the time as Yathrib. It gets renamed Medina, which means city of the prophet. And there's, all these beautiful details in Islam around this. There's a search party from Mecca that is sent to kill the Prophet Muhammad and his companions. The prophet hides in a cave. Around the cave, God places a rock, the nest of a rock dove and the web of a spider, so that the search party thinks nothing can be in this cave, because otherwise it would clearly have disturbed the web and the nest of the rock dove. So it's this kind of magical migration, this mystical spiritual migration, right? And he arrives in Medina and Yathrib, and the children of Yathrib, becoming Medina, welcome him with a song, right? The refugee is holy. We welcome the traveler. They become known as the Muhajirun, the travelers. We welcome you with song. Amongst the first things the Prophet Muhammad does is he sets up a fair market, a market where sellers can sell their wares fairly and buyers can buy them fairly. Amongst the second most important things he does is create something called the Constitution of Medina, which is a pact of loyalty and freedom between the diverse tribes of Mecca. If you want to stay pagan or Jewish or Christian, you're free to do that, but we will weave ourselves into a pact of mutual loyalty and defense, Constitution of Medina, right? Clearly, there are resonances here for a diverse democracy. How do you think of migrants and refugees? Do you welcome them with song? How do you think of allowing different communities to keep their practices and yet work together in cooperative ways? How do you think of the fairness of a market, right? That migration, how can it symbolically be useful now? Second migration I want to speak of, and then I will turn it back over to Ghulam Abbas for my interlocutor to have his say. Second migration is known as the Migration of Abyssinia. So in the years that the Prophet Muhammad, pre-622, is preaching in Mecca, and he's increasingly concerned that the Quraysh and other tribes in Mecca will in fact destroy the fledgling Muslim community, because it is a threat to a particular, kind of a particularly aggressive capitalism. The Prophet sends a small contingent of his followers, led by his relative Ja'far, to Abyssinia. And the Prophet says, believes that in Abyssinia, the Muslim community will be safe because the Negus, the king of Abyssinia, the emperor, is a Christian. And the Prophet knows the deep similarities between Islam and Christianity and believes that the Negus will protect this small group of Muslims. So there's a set of anti-Islam Meccans which make their way to to Abyssinia and they whisper in the ear of the Negus, you have these foreigners present who are threatening and dangerous, and you should see what's going on. So the Negus calls Ja'far and this small contingent of Muslims to his court, and he says, tell me who you are. Tell me about you. And Ja'far famously recites the verses of the Quran that speak of the holiness of Mary to the Negus. And the traditions say that the Negus and his bishops are so moved that they weep so copiously that their beards are soaked with their tears. Their beards are soaked in their tears. And the Negus draws a line in the sand with his staff and says, the difference between your religion and mine is no thicker than this line in the sand. You are welcome and safe in my kingdom. So there's a set of Muslim scholars who are increasingly speaking of the Abyssinia model in nations in which Muslims are a minority, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, etc., right? And they say, look, we Muslims have thought too much about the dangers of Mecca, places where we're hounded out, and the glories of Medina, places where when we come, the city over time all converts to Islam. We need to be thinking of an Abyssinia model where we can be a creative minority within a broader society. Right? Again, how are migrations, kind of archetypal migrations, John Winthrop, the migration of the Arabella, the city on a hill sermon, how do those get transposed and changed over time? How does we see how the prophet does this with the Hajj? How can the migration, the Hijra, the Abyssinia migration, how might those serve as powerful symbols, not just for Muslims in diverse democracies, but perhaps for the whole diverse democracy itself? It is not stated anywhere that the only binding language for the United States or the United Kingdom has to be Christian in nature. Why couldn't it be Jewish or Hindu or Muslim? Could the language and symbols from different religions provide binding narratives for diverse democracies? Over to you, Ghulam Abbas.
Wow, Eboo, thank you very much for such a deeply thought-provoking discussion. There's so many important strands that you have weaved together into this rich tapestry that I hope we will be able to explore during the Q&A. I have the distinct honor of introducing a truly remarkable person, a friend of the Oxford Interfaith Forum, indeed one of our patrons, an individual who has had not just one, but 3 successful careers. Most of us struggle with one, but he's had 3. Success in medicine as a psychiatrist, success in academia, and of course, most notably in public service. Lord Alderdice is a psychiatrist who, as leader of Northern Ireland's Alliance Party, was one of the key negotiators of the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. And for those from different lands who may be unfamiliar, this was a really seminal achievement that brought peace after decades of the troubles, of the violence. So this was a really outstanding achievement. And then he went on to be the first speaker of the new Northern Ireland Assembly, and subsequently one of 4 international commissioners who oversaw security normalization in Ireland. A member of the House of Lords since 1996 and convener of the Liberal Democrats in the Lords during the coalition government. He was president of Liberal International, the global federation of liberal parties, and currently has various appointments at the University of Oxford, including as director of the Center for the Resolution of Intractable Conflict. It's a great pleasure to hand the floor to you, John.
Thank you very much indeed, Ghulam Abbas and other colleagues. It's always a delight to join with you, and not least in this session today. It's on pilgrimage and migration, and I'm going to focus particularly on the question of pilgrimage. One of the reasons that I've been thinking about pilgrimage is that in recent times, my wife and I have had a home in France near to the great medieval religious centre of Cluny and the current faith community of Thésée. And the ancient route on which our old home is situated is one of the traditional routes to Santiago de Compostela, And so we see people on foot making their way from the north of France and other places on a pilgrimage, not a tourist trip, but a long journey in search of a religious experience that may bring new or deeper meaning about themselves, others, nature, or a transcendent or higher good. A journey that they hope will lead to some degree of personal transformation that they can bring back into their daily lives. For Muslims, of course, the preeminent pilgrimage, as we've already heard, is the Hajj, the annual pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia, where the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was born and received the first revelations given in Arabic that went on to become the Holy Quran. It's a sacred place, partly at least because it's where Islam started, and the Hajj is a mandatory religious duty for Muslims to be carried out, if possible, once in their lifetime by adult Muslims who are physically and financially capable of undertaking it and supporting their family while they are away. And that's one of the 5 pillars of Islam, along with the declaration of faith, 5 times daily prayers, giving a portion of income to those in need, and fasting during Ramadan. Jerusalem is also a holy place for Muslims, but even more particularly for Jews. So their holiest place of pilgrimage is Jerusalem, especially during the Passover. There are other pilgrim festivals for Jews, the Festival of Weeks, the Festival of Tabernacles or tents or booths, and the Western Wall in Jerusalem, of course, the remaining section of the temple, is the holiest place for pilgrimage for Jews. But of course, Jerusalem is also the holiest place of pilgrimage for Christians. And Christianity has a strong tradition of pilgrimages from certainly the time of Origen in the 3rd century on, both to sites relevant to the New Testament narrative, especially in the Holy Land, but later Rome and other sites associated with later saints or miracles. Oxford, where some of us are based, and especially Christ Church Cathedral, have long been places of pilgrimage, as is Canterbury, Lindisfarne, and other places. I was recently revisiting St. David's Cathedral in Wales, where I was told very proudly by the Welsh that in the Middle Ages, a pilgrimage to St. David's was said to be as valued as one to Jerusalem, or perhaps 2 pilgrimages to St. David's as to 1 pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And of course, the Holy Week, the time of Easter, is the most holy time for Christians to pilgrimage to Jerusalem, recalling the final week of Jesus' life before his crucifixion there. So Jerusalem is a holy place of pilgrimage for Jews, Christians, and for Muslims. Sadly, it's also a place of conflict of Jews, Christians, and Muslims, particularly in recent times. So what is this purpose of Christian pilgrimage? And how does it differ from and how is it similar to other faith pilgrimages? Well, a previous Pope Benedict said, to go on pilgrimage is not simply to visit a place, to admire its treasures of nature or art or history. To go on pilgrimage really means to step out of ourselves in order to encounter God, where he has revealed himself, where his grace has shone with particular splendor and produced rich fruits of conversion and holiness. Christians go on pilgrimage to strengthen their spirit, and I think that is also true of Muslims and Jews. But of course, pilgrimages also have great importance in Hinduism. Going on a pilgrimage is considered good karma, and millions of Hindus travel across India for pilgrimages, small and large, every year. The most famous pilgrimage in the Hindu tradition, of course, is the Kumbh Mela, which takes place at the Ganges. And up to 40 million people come to purify themselves in the water and feel closer to God. It's the biggest gathering of people on earth. And Hindus try to make at least 1 pilgrimage in their lifetime, not necessarily to the Ganges, but many, of course, do make it to the Ganges. In that area, the Gangetic plains of northern India is also a very important place for the pilgrimages of Buddhists, though there are other places as well in southern Nepal and the area between New Delhi and Rajir. This is the area, of course, where the Buddha lived and taught, and the sites associated with his life are important places of pilgrimage. And indeed, there are other countries which have important Buddhist shrines and places. And pilgrimage has been an important facet of Japanese religion. Shinto features pilgrimages to shrines and rounds of pilgrimages where pilgrims will visit a series of sacred sites, a kind of an established circuit of pilgrimage. And in China, Wudang Mountain in the northwest of Hubei province is for Taoist pilgrims, perhaps the most best known of the pilgrimage sites. It's also a UNESCO World Cultural Heritage Site, but that's not the most important thing for pilgrims who go. They go to a place which is very ancient and which has got powerful natural beauty, tranquil valleys with precipitous peaks and an ancient Taoist temple complex, going back to as far back as 1300 during the Tang dynasty, but each dynasty after that adding something. And of course, this pilgrimage idea goes back in Europe to the antiquity of Greece. The Eleusinian mysteries contained a procession from the Athenian cemetery. So this business of traveling long distances to buildings with religious significance, often associated with the founder of the faith, this is something that we find right across the world. But apart from these traditional major faith families, First Nations also have pilgrimage traditions. In this excellent book, Magdalena, which was just published a year or two ago by the Canadian anthropologist Wade Davies, he describes how the spiritual leaders in what we now call Colombia make pilgrimages not just to the mouth of the Rio Magdalena down at Cartagena, where it enters the Caribbean, but right up to its source. They travel more than 1,000 miles upriver, conducting ceremonies, making offerings, singing to the water, assessing its health and well-being at every point along its flow, caring for the river, ascertaining how other people are measuring up as cosmic stewards. And actually, the Huaco people don't make a distinction between the water found within the human body and what exists outside it. They believe the rivers are a direct reflection of the spiritual state of a people, an indicator of the level of consciousness that a community possesses. They are, the waters are, the soul of any land through which they flow. And as the mamos, the spiritual leaders, proceed along this pilgrimage up the river, they offer prayers for the river and sing songs. And for Colombia to cleanse and liberate its soul from all the horrible things that have happened there over the last couple of generations, they believe that apart from the human relations, they must return life and purity to the river and to the country. And Wade Davis says, and he obviously had a different perspective and belief, but he says, whatever weight one gives to their words, that's the words of the mamos, the spiritual leaders, however one chooses to recognize, celebrate, or even dismiss their contributions to the patrimony of the nation, one thing is indisputably true. Imbuing water with a sense of the sacred, as they do, is not contrary to science, but rather an acknowledgement of the complexity and wonder of ecological and biological systems. So this whole question of pilgrimage is something that's profoundly deep in the human condition. It's not just a question of tourism. Frank Fahy, the Christian priest, speaks about how the difference between tourism and pilgrimage is that pilgrimage has a faith expectancy, a search of wholeness, maybe solitary or it may be with others, but it's trying to create a sacred space internally that will make changes externally, trying to search for something better in life, a commitment. These elements of religious experience are key to understanding pilgrimage. And of course, we can't, in coming from the Oxford area, forget that the most famous book in the world on pilgrimage is The Pilgrim's Progress. John Bunyan, born in Bedfordshire in 1628, during the 12 years he spent in Bedford jail because he was a dissenting preacher, he wrote Grace Abounding, a very fine book on religious experience, but also wrote the first part of Pilgrim's Progress. Published in 1678, it has never been out of print, and even during his lifetime, more than 100,000 copies of it were sold, and it continues to be sold and read across the world. And what is this? It is it is a dream, the Pilgrim's Progress. And I think one of the important things about that was that people like Bunyan were very upset, and this reflects back on what was being said previously by Eboo, were very upset that the spiritual life was understood in a physical and practical sense. And for him, it wasn't the performance of a task that was the saving or spiritual aim of the pilgrimage. The physical exercise opened up the possibility of spiritual experience. The Protestant Puritan idea was that over generations, physical things, buildings, beautiful buildings, physical exercises, religious exercises, had replaced the spiritual reality that was meant to exist. Because we have this kind of concretizing tendencies as human beings. When we create pictures that represent something spiritual, the representations tend themselves to become an object of worship. And we forget what was behind them, what were they there to represent. In fact, one of the characteristics, not just of Protestant Puritanism, but of Islam, is this attempt to try to take the pictures or representations out of the story. So in Islam, you don't have pictures of created things in religious buildings. And it was the same in Protestantism. In Catholic and Anglican churches, there were lots of stained glass and statues and so on and so on. What the Calvinists and the Baptists and the Puritans did was to remove all of those things with the idea that it would get people to focus back on the spiritual dimension. But there's a problem about all of this, because that's a sort of assumption, which is actually true intellectually in the Enlightenment as well, that we can remove ourselves from the physical dimension, that we can focus on the intellectual or the psychological or the spiritual. But the truth is that as human beings, we are physical. And it's the emotion, and emotion is a very physical thing, that gives conviction to the things that we believe and the things that we do. So that what affects us physically cannot be entirely excluded in our considerations. And it keeps coming back in various kinds of ways. And one may say that there are other things that keep coming back, the question of time in life, as well as space. And that's important for pilgrimage. So pilgrimage is present in all these faith traditions. And in talking with people who are focused today on the provision of pilgrimage opportunities, it's clear that pilgrimage itself is coming back for many people who seek a spirituality that is not necessarily linked with the historic faith families. And I think it's really useful to study this, because it's studying a search for transcendent experience and spiritual development, which is using both the capacity to think and reflect and the physical experience of pilgrimage. I sometimes thought in the past, my background in medicine is in psychiatry and psychoanalysis, that there was a sort of spiritual pilgrimage in the sense of psychoanalysis. And I thought, well, there's one that doesn't have such a physical component, but it does, of course. It does in the negative, in that in analysis, you lie down, you do not move, you don't get up and move around and so on. And that restriction of the physical, that discipline, is actually an important component in enabling people to think and reflect and speak about how they feel. So the physical and the mental or spiritual is very important, as indeed is the social dimension. And so I suppose what I'm speaking about here and reflecting on pilgrimage is to say that this is in the nature of human experience. And if we try to deepen our understanding of it, not from one particular tradition, but from the commonalities of all the traditions and of what it is to be a human being, then we may deepen our understanding of the being of humanity, and indeed that which takes us beyond it and helps us to transcend our own personal experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, John. That was inspiring, and There's so many important points about the intersect between theology, sociology, and realpolitik in that we could discuss this all night. Thank you for sharing the gems of your experience. We have about 15 minutes for discussion and Q&A. I would like to begin by just acknowledging the presence of one of our great friends here at the Oxford Interfaith Forum. Professor Diane Obenchain is a senior professor of religion and has been a guiding light for us here, as well as, of course, at Fuller. And given the breadth of issues that we've discussed this evening, I'd like to begin the comments and discussion section by requesting her to share some of your views, Diane, and your reflections upon the range of issues that John, Eboo, and Elizabeth have kindly set the stage for us to explore.
Well, you're very, very kind to invite me into the conversation. I'm very grateful for what you've said. I am thrilled with the contributions of both our presenters today, Eboo and Lord Alderdice. And as each spoke, I've been taking notes because I'm refining my own book on this topic. But what I'd like to ask first of Eboo is what he means as a binding narrative for diversity. What is a binding narrative? That's my first question. And then for Lord Alderdice, I'd like to ask the question, I think you've hit it on the head. We have all gathered so much wealth in this world, and modernity has given us so many space-time comforts. Could this be one of the reasons why pilgrimage through this world to the next has lost its deeper spiritual meaning, as you talk about? Those are my two questions to each of them.
Thank you so much, Professor Obenchain. Profound questions, and I'll address the one that you asked to me. So Andy Delbanco, the Alexander Hamilton professor at Columbia University, says that what a nation really is a group of disparate people who share a story, right? And increasingly, David Brooks and Leon Cass just reflected on this on a podcast. For a long time in the United States, the understanding was we thought of ourselves as sharing the Exodus story, right? And of course, Winthrop is kind of the archetypal example of this notion of leaving a place where you are not as free as you want to be to come to a place where you are free. This is the story of the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible, right? And so but what's remarkable about the story is that it's not just used by Winthrop. Again, what is he escaping? He's escaping the influence of the Catholic Church in the Anglican Church, which is not something that is emphasized at all in the United States today, because that's negative, right? We want that migration to be used in a binding manner, in by which I mean, and this is your question, connects us more deeply to each other. And as Michael Walzer and many others have noted, from the time of the Greeks in Western civilization, there was this idea that in order to have a democracy, you had to have homogeneity. In other words, it was a common religion, a common race, a common ethnicity that served as binding. If you have a diverse democracy, what binds you, right? And let's speak of this in very concrete terms. For 200 and some years in the United States, we have typically accepted the results of elections. Okay, it's been a little bit complicated this last year, but it is a remarkable thing to say that my neighbor, who looks different and prays different and has different values, has the right to rule over my life. If she votes for somebody different than I vote for, and that person gets into office, that person can raise my tax rates and send my children to war. And I accept that. That's a remarkable fact of human society, that we have come to achieve that for the most part in what we in the diverse democracies on earth. What allows that to happen? A binding narrative, the notion that we think to ourselves, I feel connected to you in some way such that I will let your ideas about who should rule win over mine if they win an election, such that I will accept paying taxes for people that I will never see and who I disagree with doctrinally. So I will go to war, or many of my compatriots will, to fight for the freedom and dignity and safety of people who I totally disagree with, right? The creation of those societies is a massive achievement in human history, and it only happens because we have a story that connects us all. And so often, at least in the United States, those stories are religious in nature. What I am proposing is, as American society becomes more religiously diverse, will they be religious a la Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and not just Christianity and Judaism, as it's considered, if you will, kind of the precursor tradition to Christianity, right? Which is what the term Judeo-Christian suggests. That's the kind of out loud question that I'm asking.
Thank you so much, Eboo. And of course, you've hit the nail on the head. There is no way that we are going to adhere to a binding narrative if there were no connection in that narrative between the diverse unified whole and the Holy One. In other words, what binds us to that narrative is our, what people call the religious engagement.
Yeah, and well, I mean, this, I find this, just one quick aside before we go on to John on this. So I lived in England long enough to hear the NHS referred to as the national faith some hundreds of times, right? And I was in England during the Tony Blair years, where Tony Blair's press secretary famously said, "We don't do God," although there was more than one report of Blair having been inspired by kind of Christian humanism. And in fact, when Tony Blair leaves office, he starts the Tony Blair Faith Foundation and speaks, pretty eloquently about religion. So I think I'm from the country that, the British writer G.K. Chesterton famously said has the soul of a church, right? So, I am very much relying on the American experience of religious narratives being binding, and simply amplifying that the meaning of those narratives have changed over time, from John Winthrop's very narrow, Puritan, exclusive city on a hill to Obama's, teeming with diversity city on a hill, right? So I think a very interesting question is, in societies in which there is a lot less religiosity, like much of Europe, but are very diverse and increasingly diverse, it is very common for American ears to hear religious references in public and political life. I'm not sure how common it is for German, English, French, etc. ears to hear those. It's very common for us to think of the binding narrative, our binding narratives, in religious terms, right? I'm curious how that plays elsewhere. And of course, this could change. I mean, we're up to 25, 30% of Americans who say that they're religious nuns, and they're very welcome at the IFYC table. But it is interesting to ask a question: how does somebody who is a quote unquote religious nun, N-O-N-E, hear Lincoln's language of "we are an almost chosen people," right? That might not have the same resonance.
I'd like to pick up your question in a way that perhaps diverges a bit from the ideas that Eboo is putting forward. I come from a part of the world and spent much of my life trying to address this question of what kind of, if we like to use the terminology, binding narrative there might be for Protestant Unionists, Catholic nationalists, and those that don't subscribe to either of those politics. And the conclusion I came to was that it wasn't possible to find one. I came to hold, I suppose, to Isaiah Berlin's idea that there is not an agreement on the good. And that requires a society that's pluralist. Now, what Isaiah Berlin didn't do was go on to devise a political structure that could represent pluralism. He developed the ideas, but not the structure. And I think it's for the rest of us to explore some of those kinds of questions. But one of the things that's clear to me is that people have fundamentally different ways of being in the world. And I speak about them more as culture than religion, because many people who come from Christian societies and communities don't necessarily hold to the faith in a particularly strong way, but culturally they're hugely impacted by the way of being in the world that is represented by that kind of background. And it seems to me that actually the model that Eboo's describing, the kind of post-Enlightenment Republican model, is actually shredding at present. Less and less countries are aiming to be liberal democracies. The kind of ambition for some universal binding narrative of that kind is, it seems to me, less impressive now than it was 20 years ago. And I think what we're going to have to try to find is ways of engaging with people who have fundamentally different perspectives. Now, what's the message here? I was very much involved in the ecumenical movement until I got so preoccupied with politics. And what was clear to me whenever I came back to it 4 or 5 years ago is that it was virtually dead, and talk about ecumenical within the Christian community. And I tried to understand why, and it seems to me that if you focus on things like doctrine, authority structures, liturgies, all of these kinds of things, those are the things we differ on. The thing that is common is religious experience. We explain it in different ways, as I tried to show with pilgrimage. There's a common experience of pilgrimage, which gives us a bringing together of thinking, of feeling and physicality, of social relationship together and separately. And we put different explanations of it, and we understand it in different ways. And I rather have the feeling that if we try to get some kind of narrative that is a common explanation of those kinds of things, we may have a big problem in achieving it. And interfaith dialogue may run into the same sand that ecumenism ran into. Whereas if we try to understand the common human experience of those who put different explanations to it, and even different practices and structures, we may find something that is perhaps not a binding narrative, because a narrative's kind of here, but a way of engaging that may be more human and accepting of the plurality that is inevitable, because we don't actually have an agreement on what is the good in the way we think of that.
I find that, if I can just quick, thank you for that, John. I find that profound, and your experience is I mean, deep and very meaningful in your role in the Good Friday Accord. So thank you for that. Let me offer an explanation for why the ecumenical movement is dead. It won. It did its work. It did its work, right? So in the early part of the 20th century, there were, and way before, right? I mean, the Protestant Catholic wars in Europe, I don't have to tell you people, it almost defined a millennium. And at the beginning part of the millennium, it was defined by Catholic Muslim wars. And the last place that Protestant Catholic tension was a problem on the planet was solved by you. But and so the point that I'm making is the ecumenical movement did its work. And I think one of the things that those of us who do good for a living do not do very well is declare our victories and take our bows, right? The ecumenical movement did its work.
I know we have to finish up quite shortly, Eboo, but I have to say, I think you need to be a little careful. I don't believe that these issues are as solved as you speak about at all. Brexit is a representation of the way that people with a perspective and a way of being decided they didn't want to be part of the binding narrative of European Union. What's happening with Orthodox Christians at the moment in the East and with Russia, we're actually on the verge of a war about those kinds of issues. So I guess
That's not a
part of this is
Catholic
personality.
Protestant.
I'm more pessimistic and you're more
I totally agree. The point about what's happening in Russia with the Orthodox Church, I mean, you have whatever, 80 years of communism, and then all of a sudden there's a re-engagement with religion. It is a binding narrative for a homogenous vision. And the main point that I am making is both in India and in Russia, right? Serbia as well, it is fascinating to see religious symbolism used towards an exclusive homogenous vision. What that tells me, and I understand that I have a biased stake in this, right, is that there is something deeply powerful about religious language, and I do not want to forfeit it to the exclusivists of the world, right?
Thank you. That's a really powerful point, Eboo. Forgive me for interjecting. I'm just conscious of the clock.
You did that so well, Ghulam Abbas.
I'm really sorry. I just want to make sure. Firstly, please do forgive us for having overrun by 2 minutes. But this is a conversation that is so rich and vibrant that I do not apologize too much, because I'm sure you have enjoyed this wonderful interaction that is so rare to bring such individuals together. In the interest of time, I would like to request briefly, but I would be remiss if I overlooked altogether, a request to Elizabeth just to share your reflections, having initially set the context for our debate. It would be good to have your summative thoughts on how you are seeing these different strands come together, having set the hair running. What do you see about where the conversation has reached and where the open questions are? Because it's the questions that the Oxford Interfaith Forum is really here to grapple with.
Well, gosh, Ghulam Abbas, you've given me an almost impossible task here, because
it's just a tribute to how I see your ability.
Oh my gosh, well, because I mean, it's been such a special and engaging dialogue, and the fact that first of all, I thought it was really beautiful that the two of you disagreed in some quite profound ways, with mutual respect and with a concern for identifying where is their common ground and where is their disagreement. I found myself reflecting on pessimism, optimism, on how your context shapes you, your life experience shapes you, how the, I mean, frankly, I listening to John, just really thinking about the trauma of what appears to be sort of the failure of the European ideal in the post-Brexit moment. But I think from both of you, what I would take to be sort of a direction that is more hopeful is that both of you see, whether it's the language or the kind of core concepts of religion and faith, as offering, whether it's solace or solution. I mean, I think there's disagreement with, are we seeing how people crave the light can seek the light even in dark times. I see some of that in what John is sharing about the shared language of pilgrimage across faith traditions. And in the case of Eboo, a sense that there is space and need and real hope for religious narratives, including from minority religions within these diverse democratic societies, to become the new binding narrative. So I think in both cases, I guess back to Ghulam Abbas, that they point to the importance of these kinds of dialogues and to engaging with questions of faith and religion in contemporary life.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'd like to really express my profound thanks to all our speakers, particularly Eboo and John for the extended discussions you've provided, and of course, Elizabeth for setting the context in your summary. This is an example of the kind of vibrant debate we're hoping to foster in the Oxford Interfaith Forum. We seek to create a safe space for academics, policymakers, professionals, and the general public to be able to engage in an academic way about problems that matter across the board. If I may pick up on a strand that John mentioned about experience, and that experience is translated across the different reading groups of the forum, ranging from art in interfaith contexts to Eastern Christianity, eschatology, philosophy, psalms, sacred texts and manuscripts, and more recently, science and religion. And we will keep expanding the number of reading groups we have, bringing together thus far about 1,500 scholars across the world, as we seek to create a vibrant, dynamic, and diverse discussion agenda. On behalf of TEA and I, I'd really like to thank all our speakers and all our participants this evening. Thank you for sharing your time, and we look forward to participating together in further seminars. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.